Welcome back, everyone. Sorry about the delay there. Had a couple things that weren't working properly. Now that they are attended to, we shall get back to the book. Okay. Sorry. A couple last adjustments. Whoop it up and whoop it up. Okay. Let's go. Chapter 13. Weedmen. Now, on that night when I came to my watch, I discovered that there was no moon, and save for such light as the fire threw, the hilltop was in darkness. Yet this was no great matter to trouble me, for we had been unmolested since the beginning, since the burning of the Fungi Valley, and thus I lost much of the haunting fear which had beset me upon the death of Job. Yet though, as was not so much afraid as I had been, I took all precautions that suggest themselves to me, and built up the fire to a goodly height, after which I took my cut and thrust and made the round of the camping place at the edge of the cliffs, which protected us on three sides. I made some pause, and staring down into the darkness and listening, though this latter was but of small use because of the strength of the wind, which roared continually in my ears. Yet though I neither saw nor heard anything, I was presently possessed of a strange uneasiness, which made me return twice or thrice to the edge of the cliffs, but always without seeing or hearing anything to justify my superstitions. And so, presently, when being determined to give way to no fancifulness, I avoided the boundary of the cliffs and kept more to the part which commanded the slope up and down, which made our journeys to and from the island below. Then, it would be near halfway through my time of watching there came unto me the immensity of the weed that lay to leeward. A far distant sound that grew upon my ear, rising and rising into a fearsome screaming and shrieking, and then dying away into the darkness in a queer sobs. And so at last to note below of that the winds, at this, as might be supposed, I was somewhat shaken in myself to hear so dread a noise coming out of all that desolation. And then, suddenly, a thought came to me that screaming was from the ship of the leeward us. So I ran immediately to the edge of the cliff overlooking the weed, and stared in the darkness, but now perceived by a light which burned in the hope that screaming had come from some place at great distance to the right of her. And more, as my sense assured me it could be by no means have been possible for those in her to have sent those voices to me against such a breeze as blew at this time. And so, for a space, I stood nervously, pondering and peering away into the blackness of the night. Thus, in a little, I perceived a dull glow upon the horizon, and presently there rose into the upper edge of the moon, and a very welcome sight it was to me, for I had upon the point of recalling the bosun to inform regarding the sound which I had heard, but I hesitated, being afraid to seem foolish if nothing should befall. Then, even as I stood watching the moon rise into view, there came again to me something of that screaming, something the sound of a woman sobbing with a giant's voice, and grew and strengthened until it pierced through the roar of the wind with amazing clearness, and slowly and seemingly to echo and echo, it sank away into the distance, And there again was, in my ears, no sound beyond that of the wind. At this, having looked fixedly in the direction from which the sound had proceeded, I ran straightway into the tent and roused the bosun, for I had no knowledge of what the noise might portend. And the second cry had shaken me. Oh, my bashfulness. Now the bosun was upon his feet almost before I had made an end to shaking him and catching up with his great cutlass, which he kept always by his side. He followed me swiftly on to the hilltop. Here, I explained to him that I've heard a very fearsome sound. Apologies. No. Okay. Whew. Here explained to him what I heard the very fearsome sound which at first to proceed out of the vastness of the weed continent. And that, upon a repetition of the noise, I decided to call clear. For I knew not what might signal to us some coming danger, and at that the bosun commended me, though chiding me that I had hesitated to call him at the first occurrence of the crying. And then, following me to the edge of the leeward cliff, he stood there with me, waiting, listening, perchance that there might come again occurrence of the noise. For perhaps something over an hour we stood there very silent and listening, but there came to us no sound beyond the continuous noise of the wind. And so, by that time, I had been growing somewhat impatient of waiting. And then, the moon being well risen, the bosun beckoned me to make the round of the camp with him. Now, just as I turned away, chancing to look downward at the clear water directly below, I was amazed to see an innumerable magnitude of great fish, like unto those who I had seen the previous night, were swimming from the weed continent towards the island. As I stepped nearer to the edge, for they came so directly towards the island that I near expected them close and shore. Yet I could not perceive one, for they seemed all of them to vanish at some point 30 yards from the beaches, and at that being amazed both by the numbers of the fish and the strangeness in which they came on continually, yet never reached the shore. I called to the bosun to come see, for he had gone a few paces. Upon hearing my call, I came running back where I had pointed out the sea below. At that he stopped forward and peered very intently, and I with him. Yet neither one of us could discover the meaning of this curious exhibition, and so for a while we watched the bosun, being quite so much interested as I. Presently, however, he turned away, saying that we did foolish to stand here peering at every curious sight when we should be looking to the welfare of the camp. And so we began to go to the round of the hilltop. Now whilst we had been watching and listening, we had suffered the fire to die down to a most unwise lowness, and consequently, though the moon was rising, there was no means of the same brightness that should have made the camp light. On perceiving this, I went forward to throw some of the fuel in the fire, and then, even as I moved, it seemed to me that I saw something stir in the shadow of the tent, and at that I ran towards the place, uttering a shout and waving my cutlass thrust. Yet I found nothing, and so, feeling somewhat foolish, I turned to make up the fire, as been my intention. And whilst I was thus busy, the bosun came running over to know what I had seen, and in the same instant there ran 3 of the men out of the tent, all of them waked by my sudden cry. But I had not to tell them, save for my fancy had played me a trick, and now showing me something where my eyes could find nothing. That, and 2 of the men went back to the rescue, resumed their sleep. But the third, the big fellow who's the chosen had given the other cutlass, came with us, bringing his weapon, and though he kept silent, it seemed to me he had gathered something of our uneasiness, and for my part, I was not sorry to have his company. Presently we came to the portion of the hill which overhung the valley, and I went to the edge of the cliff, intending to peer over, for the valley had a very unholy fascination for me. Yet no sooner had I glanced down than I started, and went back to the bosun, plucked him by the sleeve, and at that, perceiving my agitation, he came to me in silence to see the matter, and it's caused me so much excitement. Now, when he looked over, he also was astonished and drew back instantly. Then, using great caution, he bent forward once more and stared down, and at that the big seaman came up behind, walking upon his toes, and stooped to see what manner of thing we had discovered, and thus we each of us stared down upon a most unearthly sight, for the valley beneath was a swarm with moving creatures, white and unwholesome in the moonlight, and the movements were some like the movements of monstrous slugs, though the things themselves had no resemblance in their contours, but reminded me of naked humans, very fleshy and crawling upon their stomachs. Yet their movements lacked not a surprising rapidity. And now, looking a little with the bosun, discovered that these hideous things were coming up and out of the pit-like pool in the bottom of the valley. And suddenly I was minded of the multitudes of the strange fish which we had seen swimming towards the island, but which had all disappeared before reaching shore. And I had no doubt but that they had entered the pit through some natural passage known to them beneath the water, and now I made to understand my thought of the previous night, that I'd seen the flicker of tentacles, for these things below us had 2 short, stumpy arms, but the ends appeared divided into hateful and wriggling masses of small tentacles, which slid hither and thither as the creatures moved about the bottom of the valley, and at their hind ends, where they should have grown feet, there seemed other flickering bunches, but these were not supposed to be this. Suppose that we saw these things clearly. It is now scarcely possible to convey the extraordinary disgust in which the sight of these human slugs bred in me. Nor could I talk, nor could I, and do I think I would for thee, for were I successful, then would others be like to retch, even as I did, the specimen coming on without premonition, and born a very horror. And suddenly, even as I stared, sick with loathing and apprehension, there came unto a view not fashioned below my feet, a face like to the face which I peered up into my own on that night as we drifted beside the weed continent. At that I could have screamed, had I been then less terror, for the great eyes, so big as a crown pieces, like the bill, like to an inverted parrot's, in the slug-like undulating of his white and slimy body, bringing me the dumbness of one mortally stricken. And even as I lay there, my helpless body bent and rigid, The bosom spat a mighty curse into my ear, and leaning forward smote the thing with his cutlass. For in the instant that I had seen it, it had advanced upward by so much as a yard. And at this action of that bosom, I came suddenly possession of myself, and thrust downward with so much vigor that I was like to follow the brute's carcass, for I overbalanced and danced giddily for a moment upon the edge of eternity. And then the bosun had me by the waistband, and I was back in safety. But in that instant through which I had struggled for my balance, I discovered that the face of the cliff was near hid with a number of things which were making up to us. And I turned to bosun, crying out to him that there were thousands of them swarming up to us. Yet he was gone already for me, running towards the fire, shouting to the men and the dead to haste to our help for their very lives. And then he came racing back with a great armful of weed, and after him came the big seaman carrying a burning duff from the campfire. And in a few moments a blaze, and the men were bringing more weed, for we had a very good stack upon the hilltop, for which the Almighty be thanked. Now scarce we had lit one fire when the bosun cried out to the big seaman to make another further along the edge of the cliff. And in the same instant I shouted and ran over to that part of the hill which lay towards the open sea, for I had seen a number of moving things about the eastward of the seaward cliff. Now here was a deal of shadow, for there was certain beyond large masses of rock about this part of the hill, and those held off both light of the moon and that from the fires. Here I came abruptly upon the three great ships moving with a stealthiness towards the camp, and behind these I saw dimly that there were others. Then, with a loud cry for help, I made at the three, and as I charged they rose up on end at me, and I found that they overtopped me, and their vile tentacles were reached out at me. Then I was smiling and gasping, sick with a sudden stench, the stench of creatures which I had come already to know. And then something clutched at me, something slimy and vile, and the great mandibles clamped in my face. But I stabbed upward, and the thing fell from me, leaving me dazed and sick, and smiting weakly. And there came a rush of feet behind, and a sudden blaze as the bosun crying out encouragement, and directly he and the big seaman thrust themselves in front of me, hurling some of the great mass of burning weed which they had borne, each of them a long reed, and immediately things were gone, slithering hastily down over the cliff edge. And so presently I was more my own man, and made to wipe from my throat the slime left by the clutch of the monster. And afterwards I ran from fire to fire with weed, feeding them, and so space passed, during which we had safety, for by that time we had fires all about the top of the hill, and the monsters were in mortal dread of fire. Else had we been dead, all of us, that night. Now, a while before the dawn, we discovered for a second time since we had been upon the island that a fuel could not last us the night at which we compelled to burn it. So the bosun told the men to let out every second fire, and thus we staved off a while of the time. Then we would have to face a spell of darkness, and the things which at present fires held off from us. And so at last we came to the end of the weed and the reeds, and many of the boys called out for us to watch the cliff's edges very carefully, and smite on the instant that anything showed, but that, should he call, all were gathered by the central fire for a last stand. And after that he blasted the moon, which passed behind a great bank of cloud. And thus the matters were, and gloom deepened as the fire sank lower and lower. Then I heard a man curse on that part of the hill which lay towards the weed continent, his cry coming up to me against the wind, and the bosun shouted us all to have care. and directly afterwards I smote at something that rose silently above the cliff edge on the opposite to where I watched. Perhaps a minute passed, and there came shouts from all parts of the hilltop, and I knew that the weed men were upon us, and in the same instant there came two above the edge near me, rising and with a ghostly quietness, yet moving lithely. Now the first I pierced somewhere in the throat and I fell backwards, but the second, though I thrust at it, it caught my blade with a bunch of its tentacles, and was like to have snatched it from me, but that I kicked it in the face, and at that, being, I believe, more astonished than hurt, it loosened my sword and immediately fell away out of sight. Now this had taken in all no more than some 10 seconds, yet already I perceived so many as 4 others coming into view with a little to my right, and that it seemed to me that our deaths must be very near. For I knew not how we were going to cope with the creatures, coming as they were so boldly and with such rapidity. Yet I hesitated not, and I ran at them. No, I thrust not, but I cut at their faces, and this to be very effectual. For this was, I disposed 3 in as many strokes, but the 4th had come right over the cliff edge and rose upon its hinder parts, as it done the others when the boatswain has succored me. At that I gave way, having very lively dread. But hearing all about me, the cries of conflict, and knowing that I could expect no help, I made at the brute, and then it stopped, stooped and reached out to one of its bunches of tentacles, sprang back and slashed them immediately as I followed us up by a thrust to the stomach, and that it collapsed into a withering white ball that rolled this way and that. And so in its agony coming to the edge of the cliff, it fell over, and I was left sick and near helpless with the hateful stench of the brutes. Now by this time all the fires about the edges of the hill were sunken into a dull, glowing mounds of embers. That which burnt nearer to the entrance of the tent was still a good brightness. Yet this helped us but little, for we fought too far beyond the intermediate circle of its beams to have benefit of it. And still the moon, which now I threw a despairing glance, was no more than a ghostly shape behind the great bank of cloud which was passing over it. And then, even as I looked upward, glancing as I might over my left shoulder, I saw with sudden horror something that had come anigh me, and upon this instant I caught the neck of the reek of the thing and leapt fearfully to one side, turning as I sprang. Thus, I was saved in the very moment of my destruction, for the creature's tentacles smashed the back of my neck as I leapt, and then I had smitten once again and conquered. Immediately after this I discovered that there was something to be crossing the dark space between the dull mound of the nearest fire that would lay further along the hilltop. And so, wasting not a moment of time, I ran towards the thing and cut twice across the head before it could get upon its hind parts, in which I positioned I had learned greatly to dread them. Yet no sooner had I slain this one than another rush of maybe a dozen upon me, these having climbed silently over the cliff edge in the meanwhile. At this I dodged, and I ran madly towards the glowing mound of the nearest fire of the brutes following me, so quick as I could run, but I came to the fire first. And then with the sun got to me, I thrust the point of my cut and thrust among the embers, and switched a great shower of them at the creatures, and at that I had a momentary clear vision of many white idiot faces that stretched out towards me, brown, clamping, champing mandibles which had their upper beaks shuddering into the lower, and the clumped, wriggling tentacles were all aflutter, and the gloom came to me again, but immediately I switched another and yet another shower of the burning embers towards them, and so directly I saw them give back, and they were gone. And this, over all the edges of the hilltop, I saw the fires being scattered in like manner, for others had adopted this device to help them in their sore straits. For a little after this, I had a short breathing space, but the brutes seeming to have taken flight, yet I was full of trembling, and I glanced hither and thither, not knowing when some or more of them would come upon me. And then ever as I glanced towards the moon, and I prayed the Almighty that the clouds would pass quickly, else we would all be dead men. And then as I prayed, there rose a sudden, very terrible scream from one of the men, and in the same moment there came something over the edge of the cliff fronting me. But I cleft it, or ever it could rise higher, and in my ears there echoed still the sudden scream which had come from the part of the hill which lay to the left of me. I dared not leave my station, for to have done would have been to have risked all. So I stayed, tortured by the strain of ignorance and in my own terror. Again I had a little spell which I was free of the molestation, nothing coming into sight so far as I could see to the right or left of me, though others were less fortunate, as the curses, sounds of blows told me. And then abruptly there came another cry of pain, and I looked up again to the moon and prayed aloud that it might come out to show some light before we were all destroyed. But it remained hid. And suddenly came to my brain, and I shouted at the top of my voice to the bosun to set the bow upon the central fire, for thus we should have a big blaze that would be very nice and dry. Twice I shouted him, saying, "Burn the bow! Burn the bow!" And immediately he replied, shouting, "All the men run to him to carry it to the fire." And this we did, and bore it to the center fire, and then ran back with all speed to our places. Thus in a moment we had some light, and the light grew as the fire took hold of the great log, the wind fanning it to a blaze, and so I faced outwards, looking to see if any of the vile face showed above the edge before me, or to my right or left. Yet I saw nothing, save for me it seemed to me. Once a floating tentacle came up a little to my right, but nothing else for a space. Perhaps it was near 5 minutes later that there came another attack, and in this I came near to losing my life through my folly in venturing too near to the edge of the cliff. For suddenly there shot up from the darkness below a clump of tentacles, then caught me about the left ankle, and immediately I was pulled into a sitting posture, so that both my feet were over the edge of the precipice, and only by the mercy of God that I had not plunged head forward into the valley. Yet as it was, I suffered a mighty peril, for the brute had my foot put up vast strain upon it, trying to pull me down, but I resisted, using my hands in the seat to sustain me, and so discovering that I could not compass my end in this wise, it slacked somewhat of the stress, and bit my boot, shearing through the hard leather, and nigh destroying my small toe. But now, being no longer compelled to use both hands to retain my position, I slashed down with great fury, being maddened by the pain and the mortal fear which the creature had put upon me. Yet I was not immediately free of the boot, for it caught my sword blade, but I snatched it away before it could take proper hold, perhaps cutting its feelers somewhat thereby, though this I can but be sure, for they seemed not to grip around a thing, but to suck to it, and then in a moment, a lucky blow, I maimed it so it loosened me, and I was able to get back into some condition of security. And from this onwards, we were free from molestation, though we had no knowledge but that of the quietness of the weed men did not portend a fresh attack. And so at last it came to the dawn in which in all this time the moon came not to our help, but being quite hid behind the clouds which now covered the whole arc of the sky, making the dawn a very desolate aspect. And so, soon after, there was sufficiently of light. We all examined the valley, but there was nowhere any of the weed men. No, nor even any of their dead, for it seemed they had carried off all such and their wounded. So we had now to do an examination of the monsters by daylight. Yet though we could not come upon their dead, all about the edges of the cliffs was blood and slime, and from the latter there came ever a hideous stench which marked the brutes. But from this we suffered little, the wind carrying it far away leeward, and filling our lungs with sweet and wholesome air. Presently, seeing that the danger was past, the bosun called us to the center fire in which burnt still the remnants of the great bow, and here we discovered for the first time one of the men was gone from us. And that we made search about the hilltop, and afterwards in the valley about the lands, but found him not. Chapter 14. In Communication. Now the search, which made through the valley for the body of Tompkins, that being the name of the lost man. I have some doleful memories, but first, before we left the camp, the bosun gave us all a very sound tot of the rum, and also a biscuit apiece, and thereafter we hastened down, each man holding his weapon readily. Presently, when we were come to the beach which ended the valley upon the seaward side, the bosun led us along the bottom of the hill, where the precipice came down to the softer stuff which covered the valley, and here we made careful search. Perchance he had fallen over and lay dead or wounded near to our hands, but it was not so. And after that we went down to the mouth of the great pit, and we had discovered the mud all about to be covered with multitude of tracks. In addition to these and the slime, we found many traces of blood, but nowhere any signs of Tompkins. And so, having searched all the valley, we came upon the weed which strewed the shore near to the great weed continent, but discovered nothing until we had made up towards the foot of the hill, where it came down to a sheer into the sea. Here it climbed onto an edge, the same from which the men had caught the fish. Thinking that Tompkins had fallen from above, he might lie in the water at the foot of the cliff, which was here, maybe 10 to 20 feet deep. But for a little space, I saw nothing. Then suddenly discovered that there was something white down in the seaway to my left, and at that I climbed down further along the ledge. In this wise I perceived that the thing which attracted my notice was the dead body of one of the weed men. I could see it but dimly, catching on glimpses of the surface of the water, smooth at whiles. It appeared to me lying curled up and somewhat upon the right side, and a proof that it was dead. I saw a mighty wound that had come near shearing away the head, and so after further glance I came in and told what I had seen, and at that, being convinced by the time that Hopkins was indeed done to death, we ceased our search. But before we left the spot, the bosun climbed to get the sight of the dead weed men, and after him the rest of the men, for they were greatly curious to see clearly the men of the creatures that had attacked us in the night. Presently, having seen so much of the brute as the water would allow, they came again to the beach, and afterwards returned to the opposite side of the island, and so, being there, we crossed over to the boat to see whether it had been harmed, but found it to be untouched. Yet that the creatures had been all about it, we could perceive by the marks of slime upon the sands, and also by the strange trail which they had left in the soft surface. And one of them told out that he had seen something at Job's grave, which will be remembered, had been made in the sand a little distance from the place of our first camp. At that, we all looked, and it was easy to see it had been disturbed, and once we ran hastily to it, not knowing what to fear. Thus we found it to be empty, for the monsters had digged down to the poor lad's body, and of it we could discover no sign. Upon this we had come to the greater horror of the weed men than ever, for we knew them now to be foul ghouls, but not let even the dead body rest in the grave. And after this, the bosun led us all back to the top of the hill, and there he looked at our hurts. For one man had lost 2 fingers in the night's fray, another been bitten savagely in the left arm, whilst the third had all the skin of his face raised in wheals where one of the brutes had fixed its tentacles. And all these had received but scant attention because of the stress of the fight. And after that, though the discovery of Hodgson was missing, now, however, the bosun set to upon them, washing and binding them up. For the dressings he made use of some of the oakum which we had with us, binding up this on with strips torn from the roll of spear duck, which we had been in the locker of the boat. For my part, seizing the chance to make some examination of my wounded toe, which indeed was causing me to limp, I found that it had endured less harm than seemed to me, for the bone of the toe was untouched, though showing bare. Yet when it was clean, I had not over much pain with it, though I could not suffer to have on the boot, and so bound some canvas about my foot until such time should it be healed. Presently, when all our wounds were tended to, which had taken time, for there was none of us altogether untouched, the bosun bade for the man whose fingers were damaged to lie down in the tent to dig, and in the same order he also gave to him was bitten in the arm. Then the rest of us he decided to go down with him and carry up fuel, for the night had been showing him how our very lives depended on the sufficiency of this. And so all that morning, we brought fuels to the hilltop, both weed and reeds, resting not until midday, when he gave us a further tot of the rum, and after that set one of the men upon the dinner. And then he bade the men, dress up by name, who had proposed to fly the kite over the vessel in the weed, to see whether he had any craft in making such a matter. At that the fellow laughed and told me the bosun would make him a kite that would fly very steadily and strongly, and this without the aid of a tail. And so the bosun bade to set without delay, for that we should do well to deliver the people in the hulk, and afterwards make all haste from the island, which no better than a nesting place of ghouls. Now, hearing the man say that his kite would fly without a tail, I was mighty curious to see what manner of thing he would make, for I had never seen the like. I nor heard of such that was possible, for he spoke of no more than he could accomplish. For he took out 2 reeds and cut them in length about 6 feet. Then he bound them together in the middle so that they formed a St. Andrew's cross. And after that he made 2 more such crosses. And then these were completed, he took 4 reeds, maybe a dozen feet long, and bade us to stand them upright in the shape of a square, so that they formed 4 corners. And after that he took one of the crosses and laid it on the square, thus the 4 ends touched the 4 uprights. And in this position he lashed it, and he took the second cross and lashed it midway between the top and the bottom of the uprights. And after this he lashed a third of the top, so that 3 of them acted as spreaders to keep the 4th longer reeds in their places, as though they were 4 of the uprights of a little square tower. Now, when he'd gotten so far as that, the bosun called out for us to make our dinners, and this we did. And afterwards a short time which to smoke, and whilst we were thus at our ease and the sun came out, the which was not done all day, and that we felt vastly brighter, for the day had been very gloomy, with clouds until that time. And with what loss of Tompkins, and our own fears and hurts, we had been exceedingly doleful. But now, as I have said, we became more cheerful and went very alertly to the finishing of the kite. At this point it came suddenly to the bosun that we had made no provision of the cord for the flying of the kite, and he called out to the men to know what strength the kite would acquire. At this, at which Joseph answered him with maybe 10 yards Senate would do. And this being so, the bosun led 3 of us down to the wrecked mast upon the further beach, and from this we stripped what was left of the shrouds and carried them to the top of the hill. And so, presently having unlaid them and set upon the Senate, using 10 yards but plotting 2 as 1, by which means progressed with more speed than we have taken them singly. And now as we worked, I danced occasionally towards Jessup, and so that he attached a band of the light duct around each end of the framework which he had made. In these bands I judged to be about 4 feet wide, and in this wise leaving an open space between the 2, so that now the thing looked like it was a puntello show, only that the opening was in the wrong place, and there was too much of it. After that he bent on the girdle of 2 of the uprights, making this a piece of good hemp rope which he found in the tent, and then he called out to the bosun that the kite was finished, and that the bosun went over to examine it, the which he did all of us, for none had seen the like of such a thing, and if I misdoubt not, the few of us had much faith that it would fly, for it seemed so big and unwieldy. Now I think Jessup gathered something of our thoughts for calling one to hold the kite, lest it blow away. He went to the den to put out the remainder of the hemp line, and from the same from which he had cut the girdle. This he bent on it, and giving it the end to our hands, bade us to go back with it until all the slack was taken up. In the meanwhile, steadying the kite, then when he had gotten back to the extent of the line, he shouted us to take the very particular hold upon it, and then, stooping, caught the kite by the bottom and threw it into the air, whereupon, to our amazement, having swooped somewhat to one side, it steadied and mounted upwards into the sky like the very bird. Now this, I may mention, we were astonished, for it appeared to be like a miracle to see such a cumbrous thing fly with so much grace and persistence. And further, we were mightily surprised in the manner which pulled upon the rope, tugging with such heartiness that we were like to have loosed it in our first astonishment, had it not been for the warning which Jessup called out to us. Now, being well assured of the properness of the kite, the bosun bade us to draw it in, which we did only with the difficulty of its bigness and the strength of the breeze, and when we had it back again upon the hilltop, Jessup moored it very securely to a piece of rock, and after that, having received our approbation, he turned to with us upon the making of the Senate. Presently, the evening drew near, and the bosun set us to building up fires about the hilltop, and after that, having waved our good nights to the people in the bulk, we made our suppers, and laying down to smoke, after which we turned to again at our plating of the Senate, the which we have gotten into great haste to have done, and so that dark having come down upon the island, the bosun bade us to take the burning weed from the center fire and set light to the heaps of the weed that stacked around the edges of the hill for that purpose. And so in a few minutes the whole of the hilltop was very light and cheerful, and afterwards, having put out 2 of the men to keep watch and attend to the fires, he sent the rest of us back to our Senate making, keeping us at it until maybe about 10 o'clock, after which he arranged that 2 men at the time should be on a watch through the night, and that he bade the rest of the men to turn in so soon as he looked over to our various hurts. Now, when it came to turn to my watch, I discovered I had been chosen to accompany this big seaman, at which I was by no means displeased, for he was a most excellent fellow, and moreover a very lusty man to have near, should anything come upon one unawares. Yet we were happy to have the night pass off without trouble of any sort, and so came the morning. So soon as we made breakfast, the bosun took us all down to the carrying of fuel, for he had very clearly that our good supply depended on our immunity from attack. And so for the half of the morning we worked at the gathering of weed and reeds for our fires. Then we attained a sufficiency for the coming night. He set us all to work again upon the Senate, and so until dinner, after which turned to once more upon the piloting, plating. Yet it was plain that it would take several days to make sufficient line for our purpose, and because of this, the bosun cast about it in his mind for some way in which he could quicken his production. Presently, as a result of some little thought, he brought out from the tent a long piece of rope which had moored to the boat, to the sea anchor, and proceeded to unlay it until he had all three strands separate. Then he bent all three together, so he had very rough line of maybe 180 fathoms in length. Yet though so rough, he judged it strong enough, and thus we had this much the less Senate to make. And now, presently, we made our dinner, and after that for the rest of the day we kept very steadily to our plating. And so, with the previous day's work, we had nearly 200 fathoms completed by the time the bosun calls to us to cease and come to supper. Thus we seen that I was counting all, including the piece of hemp line for which the birdie had been made. We may be said to have had at this time about 400 fathoms towards the length of which needed our purpose, having thus reckoned at 500 fathoms. After supper, having lit all the fires, we continued to work blading, and so until the bosun set the watches, after which we settled down for the night. First, however, letting the bosun see our hurts. Now this night, like to the previous, brought us no trouble. And then, when the day came, we had first our breakfast, then set to upon our collecting of fuel, after which we spent the rest of the day at the Senate, having manufactured a sufficiency by the evening, the which the bosun celebrated by a very rousing talk of the rum. Then, having made our supper, we lit the fires, having a very comfortable evening, after which we proceeded nights, having let the bosun attend to our wounds. We settled for the night, and on this occasion the bosun let the man who had lost his fingers and the one who had been bitten so badly in the arm take the first turn at watching since the night of the attack. Now, when the morning came, where all of us were very eager to come to the flying of the kite, for it seemed impossible that we might effect the rescue of the people in the hulk before the evening. And at the thought of this, we experienced a very pleasurable sense of excitement. Yet before the bosun would let us touch the kite, he insisted we should gather our usual supply of fuel, the which order, though full of wisdom, irked us exceedingly, because of our eagerness to set about the rescue. But at last this was accomplished, and we made to get the line ready, testing the knots and seeing that it was all clear for running. Yet before setting the kite off, the bosun took us down to the further beach to bring up the foot of the royal gallant mast, which remained fast to the topmast, and when we had gotten up the hilltop, he set its ends upon two rocks, after which he pulled a heap of the great pieces around them, leaving the middle part clear. Round this he passed the kite line a couple or 3 times, and then gave the end of Jessup to bend on to the girdle of the kite, so he had all ready for paying out to the wreck. And now, having nothing to do, we gathered round to watch, and immediately the bosun giving the signal, Jessup cast the kite into the air, and the wind catching it lifted strongly and well, so the bosun could scarce pay out fast enough. Now, before the kite had been let go, Jessup had bent the forward end of the great length of the spun yarn, so that those in the wreck could catch it as it trailed over them. And being eager to witness whether they was to secure without trouble, we all ran to the edge of the clear hill to watch. Thus, within 5 minutes of the time of the loosing of the kite, excuse me, apologies. We saw the people in the ship wave to us to cease veering. Immediately afterwards, the kite came swiftly downwards, to which we knew they had the tripping line, and were hauling upon it. And at that, they gave out a great cheer, for afterwards we set about and smoked, waiting until they had read our instructions, which they had written upon covering the kite. Presently, maybe half an hour afterwards, they signaled to a haul upon our line, which proceeded to do without delay. And so after a great space, we had hauled in all of our rough line and come upon the end of theirs, which proved to be a fine piece of 3-inch hemp, new and very good. Yet we cannot conceive that this would stand the stress necessary to lift so great length of clear weed, as would be needful, or ever we could hope bring the people of the ship over to safety. And so we waited some little while, and presently they signaled to us to get into a haul. And we did. Found that they bent on much greater rope to the bight of the 3-inch hemp, having merely intended the latter for a hauling line by which they get the heavier rope across the